What we leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but what is woven into the lives of others. This is Eurohistory Hub. I'm Elizabeth. Welcome to our third deep dive into Eurohistory. Today we're focusing on the Aegean world. Minoans, Mycenaeans, and Trojans, covering roughly 1750 to 1100 BC.
Hi, I'm Andrew. We're so excited to explore this really captivating chapter of Europe's past with you. This deep dive, like all the others we do, is designed to get you well-informed pretty quickly, hopefully with some surprising facts and new insights.
Yeah, and for this journey, we're drawing our insights primarily from a really excellent historical text, The Birth of Classical Europe, A History from Troy to Augustine, by Simon Price and Peter Thunman.
Exactly, and this period, it's just foundational, isn't it? It laid so much groundwork for what we think of as classical Europe later on.
Totally. So settle in, because we're about to unpack some incredible stories and some pretty surprising archaeological finds that really changed how we view the ancient world.
Okay, so where do we start? When you think about the Aegean, it's almost impossible not to begin with Homer, right? The Iliad, the Odyssey.
Those epic poems, yeah. Tales of the Trojan War, Helen, Achilles. They've gripped people for millennia.
And what's fascinating is how these stories, even though they're largely fiction, became so fundamental to identity in antiquity. Greeks, Romans, they saw these events, the Trojan War, as sort of the founding acts of European history.
But before we jump to how important they were later, we really need to get a handle on the actual historical period they describe. The time when these great palaces were flourishing in Crete and mainland Greece.
Right. And that takes us straight to Heinrich Schliemann, born in 1822, a businessman. Quite a controversial figure, really.
He even made money from the Californian gold rush. And he claimed that Homer inspired him, from when he was just a kid, to go and dig up Troy.
Yeah, those claims might be a bit embellished. Part of his rich fantasy life, as some put it. But look, by his late 30s, he definitely had the money to follow his passions. So in 1871, he starts digging at Hizarlik in Turkey, convinced it's Homer's Troy. He wasn't alone, though. Frank Calvert, a British archaeologist, was already working there.
Okay, but this is where it gets messy, isn't it? Schliemann's methods, they were bad, even for back then.
Notoriously poor. He basically just trenched right through all the layers of the site. He was fixated on finding King Priam's Troy and decided level 2 was it.
And he was even accused of planting fines, or just being incredibly sloppy with records.
Both. But despite all that, his work and honestly his knack for publicity really cemented Hizarlik in the public mind as the Troy, Homer's Troy.
So despite the flaws, what's the bigger picture? What did he actually achieve?
Well, two monumental things, really. First, think chronologically. Back in the early 19th century, many in Western Europe thought the Trojan War was pure myth. Time itself was seen as starting pretty recently. Remember Archbishop Usher's 4004 BC creation date? That was a common idea.
Right.
Schliemann literally dug up proof of a much, much older prehistoric period in the Aegean. For 1,000 years, maybe more, of complex societies, big monuments, trade. He showed there was this significant time before.
Okay, that's huge. And the second thing?
Technical. He grasped that just looking at big monuments wasn't enough for dating things accurately. He pioneered using pottery, how styles change over time, and it lasts well to build relative chronologies.
And we still use that today.
Absolutely. Pottery sequences are still the backbone of archaeological dating. It was a massive leap forward.
Okay, so Schliemann was chasing Homer. What about the next big name, Sir Arthur Evans? What was driving him?
Evans, born in 1851, came from an archaeological family. His big interest was different. He was hunting for early forms of writing.
Right. He met Schliemann, then became keeper at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. He wanted to push archaeology beyond just Greece and Rome.
Exactly. It wasn't until 1894 that he got to Crete. He was drawn by these Aegean writing systems, collecting engraved seals and gems.
And he zeroed in on Knossos.
Yes, Knossos was already known as a promising site. People like Pocock and Kalakarinos had found ruins there, even connected them to the Minotaur myth and the labyrinth. Evans wanted to buy the land, dig it himself, hoping for clues about early writing. Schliemann had wanted to dig there too, actually, but couldn't sort out the money.
But there were delays for Evans, too.
Yeah, the political situation. Crete was fighting for independence from the Ottoman Turks. That held things up.
But eventually.
By early 1900, the Turks were gone, Crete had autonomy, and Evans got the site and the permit. And what he found was just astonishing.
He realized it was different from the mainland.
Immediately, he saw this prehistoric Cretan culture was distinct, non-Hellenic, totally different from Mycenaean Greece.
So he needed a name.
And he borrowed it from myth. King Minos. He coined the term Minoan for this unique culture. His digs at Knossos just confirmed it all. This huge palace of Minos, elegant architecture, those amazing, vibrant wall paintings, the unique pottery.
And the tablets, the writing he was looking for.
Yes, the engraved tablets written in a script we now call Linear B.
Evans also faced criticism, though, right? About his interpretations, his reconstructions.
Oh, definitely. He was maybe reluctant to fully accept that the Mycenaeans eventually took over from the Minoans on Crete. And some of his reconstructions, well, they're debated. But you have to give him credit. He had the vision, he put in the work, and he was determined to share what he found. He's still central to Cretan archaeology.
Okay, so let's talk about that Minoan period. The Second Palace period, starting around 1750 BC, sounds like a golden age.
Immense prosperity, yeah. But then, around 1430 BC, bam, violent destruction at many sites.
And that's when the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece show up on Crete.
Around that time, yes. But it doesn't look like a simple, straightforward conquest. The evidence suggests more of a mix. Some force, yes, but also blending in maybe collaboration with the existing Minoan elites.
Interesting. So Knossos becomes the main administrative hub.
Right, by the late 15th, 14th centuries BC. And crucially, Greek becomes the language of administration there.
And this Mycenaean period on the mainland in Crete sees more prosperity.
It does, for a while. But then, around 1100 BC, which is where our focus ends for this deep dive, the whole palatial system just stops working across the Aegean.
Leading to huge changes.
Massive social and political upheaval. The Aegean world basically fragments.
Okay, so we as learners need some perspective here.
Yeah.
How powerful were these Minoans and Mycenaeans?
That's a really important question. It's easy to get carried away, but we shouldn't overstate their power. These palace states in the Aegean were actually kind of on the western edge, the fringe, of a much wider world.
Dominated by
Much bigger, more sophisticated states in the Near East. Think about Egypt's New Kingdom, around 1500 BC, stretching over 1,200 kilometers.
wow.
And you had major players in Anatolia and Mesopotamia too. The Kassites in Babylonia, Assyria, the Hittite Empire with its enormous capital, Hattusa.
Bigger, more complex states.
Absolutely. These Near Eastern empires had institutions that look surprisingly modern. Territorial states ruled from a center, using history to legitimize their rule, engaging in complex diplomacy, lots of trade.
Like the Amarna letters.
Exactly. Those 350 letters between the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and other great kings calling each other brother. It shows a sophisticated diplomatic network.
So putting it bluntly, compared to these guys.
Compared to Egypt, the Hittites, Babylonia, the Minoan and Mycenaean palaces were, well, pretty small players on the world stage. Important to us, but relatively minor then.
Right, context is key. So let's zoom back into the Aegean. Crete alone had multiple palaces.
At least 7 major ones, yeah. Knossos and Phaistos were the biggest. They formed this network, sharing architecture, functions, moving goods between them.
Covering the whole island.
Not quite. Central and eastern Crete, a bit of the north coast they were in the system. But the west and southwest, places like Sphakia, seem to have been outside it, with much smaller settlements.
And the Knossos excavations really captured the public imagination, didn't they? Even connecting to Atlantis.
Oh yes. People immediately started talking about Plato's Atlantis legend. Some scholars back then tried to link it to maybe garbled Egyptian memories of Minoan Crete. And that theory, linking Atlantis to the Minoans or the Santorini eruption, just keeps popping up, even today.
People are still searching. Off Cyprus, using Google Earth.
Huh?
It's amazing how Plato's story, which wasn't even central to his work, took hold.
It is. And the myths, like the Minotaur, the bull-leaping frescoes from Knossos, they inspired 20th century artists too, like Picasso.
Okay, back to the palace itself, Knossos. Built around 1700 BC. What was it like?
An incredible place. It was definitely a setting for rituals, maybe that bull-leaping we see in the art. It had a grand entranceway, this big ceremonial central court that's a key feature of all Cretan palaces, and a throne room.
And advanced features? Plumbing?
Surprisingly advanced, yes. The residential area had light wells, ways to get air circulating, and even indoor plumbing. Evans thought there were separate areas for men and women, but we don't really see evidence for that now. Plus, huge storage areas, workshops for luxury crafts.
Meanwhile, over on the mainland, palaces pop up a bit later.
Yeah, evolving out of smaller chiefdoms. Soon after 1400 BC, you get palaces running at places like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes. But they looked quite different from the Cretan ones.
How so? What was the defining feature?
The megaron, Pylos is the best example because it's well preserved. You go through this elaborate gateway and you reach the Megaron. It's this big rectangular hall, 4 columns around a central hearth, a throne against the wall. That's the heart of a mainland palace.
And then they were decorated.
Oh, beautifully. The Pylos frescoes are amazing. They show Mycenaean warriors, but in these old-fashioned boar's tusk helmets fighting enemies in animal skins, it looks like they're depicting a sort of heroic past.
Not current events.
Probably not. And in the main Megaron, there's even a picture of a bard, a singer with a lyre, performing for an audience, recounting heroic deeds, probably. It shows how important history, or maybe legend, was to them.
That connects to the shaft graves at Mycenae, doesn't it? Schliemann thought he'd found Agamemnon.
He did. He famously declared, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." We know now those graves in Grave Circle A are much older, 1700, 1600 BC, centuries before any likely Trojan War.
But later rulers still valued them.
Absolutely. Around 1300 BC, the Mycenaean rulers built this massive new fortification wall, incorporating the old Grave Circle and the famous Lion Gate nearby. It strongly suggests they were positioning themselves as the heirs to these ancient, wealthy ancestors buried there, using the past to legitimize their own power.
So these mainland palaces, they also formed a system with rulers and officials.
Yes, a multi-centered system, like on Crete. You have a top ruler, the Wanax, and then a hierarchy below him, officials, local leaders, called basileis.
And those basileis survived the collapse later.
That's significant, yes. It suggests their power might have been based more on kinship, maybe predating the whole palace structure.
What about their economy? Similar to Crete?
Similar functions, yeah, administration, tracking goods, overseeing production like linen from flax. But they didn't seem to store vast amounts centrally like the Minoans did. They definitely traded widely, though, exporting things like perfumed oil, importing metals, ivory, spices. So same core functions as Cretan palaces, just a different architectural style and maybe some different administrative details.
Okay, what about how they treated their dead? You mentioned the shaft graves and tholos tombs.
Right, that's a key difference. On the mainland, before the big palaces really took hold, elites used these impressive communal tombs, the tholoi or beehive tombs, to show off their status. But during the main palatial period, fewer of these are built, and they tend to cluster around the palace centers. It looks like power and resources are becoming more centralized in the hands of the Wanax.
And on Crete.
It's really different. During that prosperous Second Palace period, there's surprisingly little evidence for elite burials at all. One idea is that the palaces themselves were so dominant, so central to society, that there just wasn't the same need or space for individual families to make grand burial statements.
Wow, that's a fascinating contrast. Okay, let's pivot to the disruptions. Around 1430 BC on Crete, things fall apart. What happened?
Well, for a long time, the prime suspect was the massive volcanic eruption on Santorini, Thera. The idea was a huge eruption, maybe a tsunami.
But that theory has problems.
Big problems. First, if it was just a natural disaster, why weren't things rebuilt? But the killer blow is the dating. Radiocarbon dating of olive wood buried by the eruption now puts it firmly in the late 17th century BC.
200 years before the destruction.
Exactly. The timing just doesn't work anymore. The volcano didn't destroy the Minoan palaces.
So what's the next candidate? Mycenaean invasion.
That was the other main theory. And there was violence. Sites linked to the palaces were targeted. We see unburied bodies, even grim evidence possibly of cannibalism under siege conditions at Knossos.
But it wasn't just a simple invasion.
Probably not. The current thinking is more nuanced. The Mycenaeans likely used force, yes, but also seemed to integrate, maybe intermarry with, the existing Minoan elites to establish a new power structure.
And Knossos itself gets rebuilt.
Yes. Interestingly, it's destroyed, but then immediately rebuilt and becomes the main Mycenaean center on the island. But it's a different world. Greek becomes the language of admin, the old courtly buildings aren't rebuilt in the same way, luxury good production changes, Knossos' dominance eventually fades by the 13th century BC anyway.
Okay, so that's Crete. What about Troy? The Trojan War itself. Schliemann's level 2 was too early.
Right. Modern archaeology points to Troy levels the 6 and the Aea as being contemporary with the Mycenaean kingdoms.
But was one of those Priam's city destroyed in the war Homer describes?
That's where it gets really problematic. You have to ask, what kind of text is the Iliad? It was composed maybe 500 years after the supposed events. It's poetry, it's myth, it's imagination. It's not a history textbook.
So archaeology can't just prove Homer right.
It's usually a mistake to try and force the physical evidence, which is often ambiguous anyway to fit a specific literary story, especially one as powerful and creative as the Iliad.
Ambiguous how? Like destruction layers could be earthquakes, accidents, not just war.
Exactly. Earthquake, fire, ritual destruction, enemy attack. It's hard to tell definitively just from burnt ruins. And while Homer blames the Achaeans, the Mycenaeans, we have other sources, the Hittite archives.
What do they say?
They talk about the region of Troy being disputed between the Hittites and a group called the Ahiawa, who most scholars now identify as the Achaeans, the Greeks. But the Hittite texts suggest ongoing tensions, maybe smaller raids or conflicts over a long period, not one single massive Achaean invasion like in the Iliad.
And there's a timing issue, too.
A crucial one. It's really hard to imagine a grand coalition of Mycenaean states sailing off to attack Troy around 1200 BC, the time Troy the Aegean might have been destroyed. Because that's precisely when the Mycenaean palace systems on the mainland were themselves collapsing, and the logistics just don't seem feasible.
So maybe the idea of conflicts around Troy became the seed for the later epic.
That's much more plausible. Real conflicts, perhaps smaller scale or over a longer time, forming the historical kernel around which the epic legends grew.
Okay, so that brings us to the big one. The general collapse around 1200 BC. End of the palaces on Crete and the mainland. Why?
Traditionally, people looked for single causes. Big earthquake, foreign invaders like the Sea Peoples, internal revolts.
But it's rarely just one thing, is it?
Almost never with collapses like this. Monocausal explanations are usually too simple. Even if there were earthquakes, why didn't they rebuild this time? It's much more likely that several factors came together, maybe environmental issues, internal stresses, external pressures like raids, and the system, which had lasted for centuries, just couldn't cope anymore.
You mentioned earlier that after some earthquakes in the 13th century, they actually strengthened fortifications.
Right. At places like Mycenae and Tiryns, they didn't collapse after early 13th century quakes. They built bigger walls, more storage. That suggests they were trying to centralize and defend against perceived threats.
But it wasn't enough in the end.
Apparently not. By the late 13th, early 12th centuries, you see widespread destruction layers across mainland Greece.
What about those invaders? The Sea Peoples, the Dorians?
Later Greek tradition talks a lot about them. But the archaeological evidence for them, being the primary cause of the mainland collapse, is pretty thin, or doesn't fit the timing well. It's perhaps better to think of a period of instability, maybe increased raiding, people moving around, a gradual breakdown rather than one single catastrophic invasion. The palaces, maybe already weakened by internal economic issues, just couldn't bounce back.
So what was lost in this collapse?
The centers themselves. The big palace buildings, the megarons, weren't rebuilt. Those extensive international trade networks, like the one the Uluburun shipwreck represented, seemed to dry up. The complex administration vanished.
And the writing system?
Linear B disappears completely. Gone.
Let's talk about that writing. It started on Crete.
Yes, likely inspired by Near Eastern scripts, but the forms were local. First, this Cretan hieroglyphic script, mainly for tracking commodities.
Then Linear A.
Developed in southern Crete, more complex, used more widely across the island, and even beyond. Still mostly admin, but also shows up on some religious items. And crucially, we're pretty sure the language behind Linear A was not Greek.
Until the Mycenaeans adopted a script.
Exactly. They adapted Linear A to write their own language, Greek. That's Linear B. It originated on Crete, probably at Knossos after the Mycenaeans arrived, and was purely administrative. We have way more Linear B tablets than Linear A, mostly from Knossos, but also from mainland sites like Pylos and Thebes, where the Mycenaeans took the script.
And it was a very specific kind of writing.
Extremely specific. It borrowed signs from Linear A, but simplified things. Used almost exclusively on damp clay tablets for making lists of personnel, goods, offerings, land holdings.
Like that tablet tracking women workers and their kids?
Precisely. Incredibly detailed for bureaucratic purposes. But here's the amazing part. For decades, scholars argued about what language Linear B represented. Most thought it wasn't Greek.
Until Michael Ventris,
an architect and amateur linguist, cracked it in 1952. He proved definitively that Linear B was an early form of Greek.
Wow. So Greek was being written centuries earlier than anyone thought.
Over 400 years before the next Greek writing we have. Yes, it's a massive link to later classical Greece.
But you said it wasn't deeply rooted.
No, that's the key difference. It was purely a tool of the palace administration. These tablets weren't meant to be permanent records like in Egypt or Mesopotamia. They were temporary dried clay, kept for maybe a year, then likely recycled.
So when the palaces went,
the writing went with them. It hadn't spread beyond that very narrow administrative context. It just vanished.
Okay, administration and language were shared to some extent eventually. What about religion? Did Minoan and Mycenaean beliefs merge?
They seem to have evolved along quite separate paths, actually. On Crete, religion seems very tied to the palaces themselves and also these open-air peak sanctuaries on mountains. Not many big formal temple buildings like in the Near East.
Knossos had ritual areas.
Definitely. Places like the tripartite shrine seem clearly cultic. And those peak sanctuaries, like Mount Juktas near Knossos, form this network of worship sites, some local, some regional.
And the mainland.
Quite different. The Mycenaeans borrowed some symbols from Crete, sure, but they didn't have the same peak sanctuary system linked to their palaces. At Mycenae, for instance, the main cult area wasn't architecturally grand, just some rooms near Grave Circle A, but with clear ritual-stuffed platforms for pouring libations, little clay figures of goddesses.
And Linear B tells us who they worshipped.
It gives us names. Some are very familiar from later Greek mythology: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, even Dionysus. Others are less familiar, like Potnia, meaning mistress or lady.
So there is continuity with later Greek religion.
Yes and no. It's tempting to see those names and draw a straight line, but we have to be careful. These Bronze Age gods existed in a totally different social and political world than the later Olympian gods. Same name doesn't always mean same god or same meaning.
Later Greeks were sort of repurposing the past.
Exactly. They adapted traditions and names they inherited, but they built new religious systems for their own very different Iron Age world.
That temptation to draw neat lines, does it apply to how we view Minoans and Mycenaeans generally? Like peaceful Minoans versus warlike Mycenaeans?
That's a very common trope. Minoans as artistic, peaceful, maybe foreign, and Mycenaeans as dour, warlike Proto-Europeans.
But you're saying that's too simple.
It's largely arbitrary, I think, and that whole European thing is really unhelpful for this period. They actually shared a lot, especially in how they dealt with the outside world settlements overseas, diplomacy, trade.
Tell us about those connections, Minoan settlements abroad.
Oh yeah, really intense connections, especially with the islands just north of Crete, the Cyclades. They set up trading posts, maybe more, on places like Thera, Santorini, Melos, Chios. Even on the coast of Turkey, at Miletus, the early layers show predominantly Minoan culture.
And then the Mycenaeans take over those connections.
Seems so. After the Mycenaeans gain influence on Crete, their culture starts appearing in these places instead. At Miletus, the Minoan settlement ends in destruction, and it's replaced by a clearly Mycenaean one: pottery, houses, tombs, the works.
What about links with the big Near Eastern powers? Egypt.
Definitely. Egyptian tomb paintings from the 16th century BC show people who look distinctly Minoan, maybe doing that bull leaping thing. Later, 15th century, paintings show Keftiu, probably Cretans bringing fancy gifts as ambassadors.
And the Hittites in Anatolia. They knew about the Aegean peoples.
They certainly knew about the Ahiawa, who, as we said, are almost certainly the Achaeans, or Mycenaean Greeks. Hittite texts from the 15th century BC onwards mention them. By the 13th century, Hittite kings are involved in diplomacy, even military squabbles concerning the Ahiawa, particularly around Miletus, which the Hittites called Milawanda.
Didn't a Hittite king even call a Mycenaean ruler his equal?
For a brief moment, yes. Hattusili III addressed one of the Ahiawa kings, maybe the ruler of Thebes, as a great king, his peer, alongside the kings of Egypt, Babylon, Assyria.
That's huge.
It is. Although, tellingly, his successor later seems to have demoted the Ahiawa king, erasing him from the list. Suggests the power balance might have shifted, or the initial assessment was revised.
And the common thread through all this is trade.
Trade underlies almost all these connections. That Uluburun shipwreck, found off Turkey, dating to around 1300 BC, is just incredible evidence.
What was on it?
A staggering cargo. 10 tons of copper ingots, a ton of tin that's bronze right there, glass ingots, ebony wood, elephant tusks, hippo teeth, exotic resins, pottery from Cyprus and Canaan, goods from all over.
Likely heading for the Aegean.
Almost certainly. And guess what? They found Mycenaean swords and seals on board too.
So Mycenaeans were involved.
Looks like it. Maybe escorting the cargo, maybe merchants themselves. It shows they weren't just passively receiving goods, they were players in this network. They imported raw materials, yes, but they exported things too. Maybe silver from Attica, probably high-quality textiles, that famous perfumed olive oil from Crete and Pylos.
And they traded west too. Italy, Sicily.
Yeah, westward trade is clear too, especially with southern Italy and Sicily, maybe Sardinia.
Yeah.
Though that seems to have been handled more by independent traders, not directly organized by the palaces like some of the Eastern trade might have been.
Okay, so summing up the Aegean world before the collapse.
You have these complex palace societies on Crete and the mainland, they have writing, administration, impressive art and architecture, wide-ranging trade networks.
But they're ultimately smaller players compared to the Near Eastern empires.
Right. And when their system collapsed around 1200 BC, the immediate legacy for the next few generations seems pretty meager. Things got simpler, more localized, a narrower world, as the book puts it.
So why do we care so much about them now? Why do they loom so large for us?
Well, two main reasons, I think. First, pretty straightforward. The language. The people running those palaces, at least by the end, especially the Mycenaeans, spoke and wrote Greek. An early form, but recognizably Greek.
The language connection.
Yes. And the second reason is maybe even more profound for how European history saw itself.
Which is this?
Memories. Memories of this Bronze Age period, especially filtered through Homer and the Trojan War legends, became absolutely fundamental for later Greeks, and then for the Romans, and through them, many other European cultures. For them, this distant, hazy Bronze Age past, particularly the Trojan War era, became the sort of dawn of their own history, the very foundation of their identity and their consciousness of the past.
So even though the direct inheritance was maybe small after the collapse, the memory of it became incredibly powerful.
Hugely powerful. It shaped how they saw themselves and their place in the world for centuries. This deep dive really shows how complex it all was, the connections, the collapses, and how the stories echoed down the ages.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Ancient Bronze Age. We hope you found some surprising details and maybe some new ways to think about these foundational European cultures.
As we've definitely seen, history is rarely simple. Often, what we think we know is just scratching the surface. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What long-held beliefs or simple stories about the past are you now curious to maybe dig a little deeper into? Until next time.